Anita Varma, and I lead the Solidarity Journalism Initiative at the Center for Media Engagement here at UT Austin. And I'm so excited for all of you to be here this evening for us to hear about a really important topic that we're calling Higher Ed Strikes and Workers' Rights, Improving Coverage of Labor Issues. And we're going to be really focused on higher education and also how labor issues in higher education relate to labor issues more broadly. I know that some folks have been to Solidarity journalism events before and some have not. So I really wanted to welcome folks for whom this is your first time joining, and really welcome back folks who have been coming for a while now. Solidarity Journalism Initiative started in 2019 when I was at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics, and it's continued since I moved to UT Austin. So we do three things. First, we do research about this idea of solidarity in journalism and how journalists cover issues of social justice and injustice. Second, we also develop free resources for journalists. So one problem that often comes up is that there's lots and lots of research about journalism and journalists, but it's not always in such a usable format. So that's another one of the things that we do as part of this initiative. And the third piece is working with individual journalists. So if you are working on a story or someone in your network is working on a story and seeking some advice or thoughts related to how to improve the aspect looking at issues of marginalization, we are available to you for that as well. And it's been such a pleasure being able to work with many journalists over the years. So would definitely encourage you to use our support when it would be helpful. I just dropped a link to our site in the chat, which as of today is also available in Spanish. So very happy for that resource to be available to all of you. I mentioned that we call ourselves the Solidarity Journalism Initiative, and I just wanted to take a minute to explain what we mean by that. So solidarity gets defined in a whole bunch of different ways. Sometimes I would argue it gets used in really distorted ways. So solidarity, in the sense that we're using it, is a commitment to social justice that translates into action, a commitment to social justice that translates into action. And in just a few minutes, you're going to hear from some folks who are engaged in those kinds of actions on a very regular basis, standing outside of journalism. Within journalism, we see solidarity happen when journalists are not only covering issues of social justice, but emphasizing, prioritizing, amplifying the perspectives of people who are living the issue. So rather than deferring to experts or officials, when reporting in solidarity, journalists would focus on the people who know because they are indeed experiencing the issue every single day, and therefore who would know better than the people living it. This word social justice also gets thrown around in a lot of highly politicized ways these days. And I just want to be clear that social justice means dignity for everyone in a society. Recently, some people have asked, maybe you shouldn't use the word social justice anymore if it's becoming a politicized term or even a dangerous term. I feel very strongly that we need to use the words that we mean and mean the words that we say. And so with that, I'm very pleased to turn things over to our moderator for this evening, Brad Lemove, who will be talking to us about a really important issue related to this question of dignity for everyone in labor contexts. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Anita. And thanks for joining us this evening, everyone. Before we start our conversation on labor issues, reporting on labor, specifically with our guests from higher ed labor graduate worker organizing efforts, I will introduce our panelists. So we will also drop their full bios in the chat shortly, so you can read more there. Joseph Guidry is a second-year astronomy PhD student worker at Boston University. Since arriving in Boston, Joseph has been organizing with the Boston University Graduate Workers Union, which is a part of SEIU Local 509. Laura Nelson is a PhD candidate in English here at the University of Texas at Austin. She is on the organizing committee of Underpaid at UT, a graduate student coalition fighting for a living wage and fair working conditions here on the UT Austin campus. So to begin, can you both tell us about your organizing efforts in your respective parts of the country and what's happened so far? A brief timeline would be pretty helpful for our audience to orient them given the ways that the organizing on different campuses is moving at different speeds and in different ways. So on this topic, let's start with Joseph.
Sure. So hi, everyone. So I'll just start off, maybe going backward or telling the story a little backwards, maybe. So the Boston University Graduate Workers Union just became a union. We're very young. We won our union election in December, on December 7th. We won it in what I am very proud to claim as a record-breaking fashion. We had the largest margin of victory in the National Labor Relations Board history for a union that is our size at 98.1%. But the story goes back a lot farther. So there were efforts in the mid-2010s to start organizing a graduate workers union at Boston University, far before I even enrolled in a university. So as Brad mentioned, I'm only in my second year here. I started in fall 2021, but back in 2016 and maybe even 2015, I get the years mixed up, there was a union drive to start organizing with the United Auto Workers, the UAW, on campus. And that ended up picking up some steam. Workers at BU started dropping cards. These are union authorization cards for those who might not be familiar. They're sort of the kind of first hurdle in the United States we have to pass in order to win a union. And so, sorry, my eyes are itchy. But ultimately that campaign failed for reasons that I don't know all the history since I wasn't on site, but with the Biden administration taking office in 2021, we got a more friendly National Labor Relations Board. It's a mouthful. And you begin to see an uptick in union elections, the labor movement again, and particularly in higher ed among graduate workers. And so we, instead of continuing to work with UAW affiliated with SEIU, that's the Service Employees International Union, Local 509, which is based in Massachusetts. And so for the past year, right around when I started getting on campus, there was a strong effort to kind of quietly organize. We were not working publicly yet, but we were going sort of door to door in our departments, talking with our coworkers, knocking on doors, kind of building the movement, making sure that we would be able to win our union of 3,500 workers. And then finally, in September 2022, we went public. We dropped our union authorization cards. We got enough cards. The threshold is 30% for those who aren't familiar to begin to meet the minimum requirement to have an election. We reached close to 60% by October. We filed for our election, and then we had our election in December and won our union. And so now we're at the stage where we're gearing up to bargain our first contract, enter collective bargaining. And so that will be happening soon, hopefully sometime this year. And so we're in the stage of figuring out our structure and getting ready to prepare for bargaining right now. So I hope that's a decent overview of our campaign timeline and where we're at right now.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Joseph. And as we saw with the UC system in the fall, and then right now with Temple University, where the graduate student union is currently on strike, it's when you get to that bargaining stage where things start to get really heated, right? Potentially. And so it's good that you guys are thinking about that structure for sure. So Lauren, how about here at UT Austin in Texas? Is it similar, these ideas of quietly organizing, union authorization cards? Like what do we have to deal with here at UT Austin?
Yeah, thanks, Brad. That's a great question. So unfortunately, no cards for us right now. I can backtrack a little bit to the sort of beginnings of underpaid and then talk in a little bit more detail about the past 2 years when I've been more directly involved, if that works for everyone. So underpaid at UT is a graduate student coalition, not formally a union right now, that came together in 2017, which coincidentally was my first year in my PhD program here. So I have a very strong memory of my first semester here. There was a massive walkout for graduate students. So walking out of the classes they were teaching, the research they were doing in the labs, assembling in front of the tower, and then doing a walk to City Hall. So that was my first exposure to underpaid and to what organizing in Texas can look like. I would say underpaid's first big win happened sort of circa 2019. So a couple of years later, when the group was campaigning against a gap in the tuition reduction benefit, it's abbreviated TRB, that a bunch of graduate students were facing. So usually as part of our compensation package for graduate students at UT, but also nationally, our tuition is compensated by the university, but because tuition had steadily risen and the compensation hadn't risen to account for it, a bunch of graduate students were paying hundreds or thousands of dollars towards their own tuition, in addition to being underpaid for the labor they were providing to the university. So underpaid opposed that, but rather than signing union cards and bargaining collectively, we have to do things a little bit different here. So they delivered a petition to the provost's office, which was followed up, there was a kind of back and forth, but eventually it culminated in a grade-in in the provost's office in, I believe, the spring of 2019. And then afterwards, the provost did eventually agree to close the tuition reduction gap that many graduate students were facing. So that was a huge win. And then to sort of fast forward to when I started being more directly involved with underpaid, there was a health insurance change that affected the health coverage of many graduate students here at UT, in most cases negatively. Our insurance was effectively downgraded. What sort of hurt me the most is that it was in response to a task force that was sort of externally audited and was supposed to provide the university with tools and evidence needed to raise all of our stipends, but the university did this by cutting our health insurance, which for many graduate students actually worsened their compensation. So underpaid rallied, and I would say is still rallying against this. And in addition to sort of like COVID related regulations, I would say at the moment, underpaid is sort of most interested in just kind of increasing the wages for graduate students across the university. I think our demands are best summarized in the open letter that we just delivered last semester to the provost's office, where we asked for a living wage for all graduate student workers at UT, as well as annual cost of living adjustments, a pause on increases to graduate student housing that the university currently owns, and an audit of the healthcare coverage that we're currently receiving, and which I would argue is inadequate for many graduate students. So hopefully that works as like a good summary of what we've been doing. But I hope you understand that I'm sort of speaking implicitly that about the structural difference between what organizing looks like for some of us, as opposed to more union-friendly states or not right-to-work states. It doesn't work through collective bargaining in the same way. It's more about just sort of making our voices heard in whatever way that we can without striking.
Great, thank you, Lauren. Before we segue onto the next kind of main topic, what is a living wage? How would you define that? And I'd like to hear from you, Lauren, as well as from Joseph.
Yeah, so I don't know if I can give a great econ definition of what a living wage is, but it's sort of, a kind of approximate calculation for the amount of money a person needs to be able to comfortably afford rent, as well as meet their basic needs in the city that they live in. So it's dependent on the cost of living in that city. The current cost of living estimate for Austin right now is at around $36,000 or $37,000 a year. I don't have the exact number on me. You know, I would imagine it's a little bit less in cities that aren't as expensive as Austin, but it's more than a minimum wage, right? It's above the legal threshold of what, you know, a business is allowed to pay you, but it is the sort of humane wage, you might say, for what a person needs to live their life.
And real quick, Lauren, what is the kind of average, or what are some of the students making, grad student workers making at UT?
So the university-wide minimum is $19,500, I believe. That's not to say all graduate students are making that. Unfortunately, graduate students across UT especially have really differential incomes. So there are some graduate students who make at or above the living wage, but I would say the majority make below. Many departments just make that base minimum, and that's true of English, where I'm housed.
Great. Joseph, how about in Boston? What does a living wage mean to you and to the union?
Yeah, it means everything that Lauren said. Again, we just want to be able to fully support ourselves off of the work we do. And similarly at Boston University, and I imagine many other universities, if not all, across the country, there's a total lack of parity from department to department and program to program. So I am in astronomy, and among the STEM kind of fields at BU, for example, we tend to have sort of the higher base stipends than other programs across the university, especially those in the humanities and in the fine arts. Many times they actually work on 8-month stipends at Boston University. And so they're paid less and also go the whole summer without any sort of form of pay from the university. So this forces them to work a second job outside of their studies and work at the university over the summer. And yet they're still subject to progressing along their dissertation if they're in a PhD program, or progressing with their master's studies. One of the tools we like to use is the MIT living wage calculator. And I don't know all the economics that go in there, but I'll drop it in the chat. It's a kind of fun tool to play around with. And so for the Boston area right now, it'll give you a number of around 47 or 48,000 a year. But I've heard that it isn't totally adjusted for the exact current level of inflation. So it might even be more like 50,000 for today's living wage. But it's kind of useful to give you a sort of baseline to think about, depending on where you live. Yeah, I don't know if I have anything more to contribute.
No, that's great. And actually, Lauren, we also use that here at UT, right? The MIT calculator. You know, again, none of us are economists, perhaps, or actually we have some people from econ organizing with us, but you know, as far as we can tell, it's a great way to measure. So moving on to specifically the question of journalism and media coverage. We have this audience of journalists, journalism educators, journalism students. Could you tell us about areas that you see that news coverage of labor issues could be improved? What would you like to see journalists cover more or help the public to understand better when reporting on this organizing? This time, let's start with Lauren on this question.
Yeah, so this is a great question. And I think I'm going to speak pretty broadly, if that's all right. So I think for me, and I feel this about a lot of news coverage in general, but it's more personal when it comes to labor reporting, is that I often feel like there is, and I think often an unintentional lack of attention to the sort of specific longer institutional histories that lead up to a certain struggle, strike, protest, sort of whatever kind of flashpoint event is being covered. Sometimes this can make the coverage look like it's a sort of administrative squabble, sort of like infighting within, you know, a university or a business or something, as opposed to workers finally speaking out after years, decades, et cetera, of being overworked and underpaid. And I think sometimes this can like also result in the idea of a win being sort of kind of not really critically examined on its own, right? I saw this a lot with the very recent UC strike. Many graduate workers and strikers that were talking to had a lot of things to say about the bargain that was reached, but not all of that was covered in the news, right? It was just sort of like, look, check mark, there was a bargain reached, the process has reached its end, right? And there didn't seem to be a lot of effort to sort of contextualize the good parts about this win, right? Because a win is a win, but also the sort of aftermath, right? And especially in attention to the sort of like material realities of what graduate students are facing, right? The idea that someone at a satellite campus is not getting a cost of living adjustment or a raise that someone at a more prestigious campus perhaps is getting, like, how does that sort of factor into the story that's being told? So again, it's like, I think the TLDR here is that just like a lot of detail and context, I think, can really enrich the story, can enrich your reporting, and can do a better job of accurately reflecting what the strikers are doing and why they're doing it.
Thank you, Lauren. Yeah, the importance of context. Joseph, would you like to take this question?
Yeah, sure. And I think Lauren is raising perhaps like the best example right now that we have to work with in this paradigm with the UC strike. Because it's really difficult. Like I kind of live on Twitter. So you would see like the official UAW 2865, which is the UC workers local 2865. They would be tweeting out, okay, they won these wages, these salary increases and other benefits, but they're not going to be celebrating what was lost whenever they were on strike and what was lost in the demands, the concessions they made. So you have to parse through all of the kind of drama that's going on, and it can be overwhelming. You have to have sources you can trust. And I think to find the sources you can trust, you really have to go to the workers. You have to center the workers' voices, because working with unions in this country, you can often, if you're talking to the union spokesperson, they might not be a worker. They'll maybe lean on what they won rather than what they conceded, and leave that out of the conversation sometimes. But if you go to the workers, if you talk to the workers, I think you'll be better suited to get the full context. You can learn about the history, what was conceded, what was the starting ask, why you maybe didn't win what you were trying to demand at first. And you have to talk to a lot of workers, because we work at really big universities. There are a lot of workers that make up our unions, and we come from many different backgrounds. Some of us are fighting for very specialized benefits. For example, I'm not a parent or a caregiver, but in BUGWU we have a minority who are, and we want to make sure they win the benefits they're fighting for. And so you have to talk to those workers. You have to find them, and make sure they are included in the narrative. And so I agree with everything that Lauren's saying. And I think the sort of first order answer is making sure the workers' voices are dominating the narrative. And I think a lot of the context kind of comes with that.
That's great. Do you have any suggestions on where journalists might start? Let's say they do want to try to find the workers, reach out to a diverse group of workers that are facing different issues, whether they're a parent, a student parent worker, an international student worker. What might be a good starting point of contact? Lauren or Joseph, either of you, if you have ideas about where a journalist might begin in terms of getting at these stories.
Yeah, I mean, I think I am interested to hear what Joseph would say about how it might work at a sort of more formally unionized system. You know, when this comes up for underpaid, for example, usually reporters will just reach out to our sort of general inbox, which reaches the organizing committee. And then we have networks of other graduate students who may be less on the organizing committee sort of board or don't show up to every single meeting, but are, you know, people that we talk to and people whose stories and needs that we know that we can refer them to. So, you know, I mean, just talk to people, don't be afraid to reach out, send emails, show up to picket lines, see if someone will talk to you. I mean, I think like, you know, if someone is involved in a cause like this, I would assume that more likely than not, they want to talk to you about what they're facing. And, you know, that may mean sort of finding unconventional ways as opposed to just going to the, you know, union representative, for example.
Great, Joseph, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. Just talk to people. When talking to workers, ask them, what are you fighting for? And so when you center the workers' perspective in your narrative, then the issues will kind of come with that. So I think you have to, by centering it around workers' voices, you're going to center around the issues they're fighting for. And so I might say, we're fighting for a living wage. We're fighting for better healthcare. We're fighting for benefits for our caregivers, benefits and better protections for international workers. And then follow up with that. Like, okay, tell me more about that. Or who can I talk to about the benefits and protections that, who would know more about the stuff that international workers need. And then, you know, hopefully they would put you in contact. Some unions, ourselves included, have specific identities and issues-based caucuses. If you go to the union's website, they might have points of contact for each of those caucuses. And so you can just pluck an email from them and follow up with them. But you can also ask the person you're talking to point them to whoever. So I think just having an organic conversation, it's kind of the thing that, you know, we do when we organize. We talk to our coworkers, and I think maybe like approaching your journalism and sort of that organizing mindset of just having a conversation. I've sort of fallen in love with this idea of doing organizing to replace yourself and bringing more people into the work. And I think of some of the best examples of coverage I've seen in the labor movement recently, it involves not just one worker talking about everything, but many workers talking about what is important to them and how it all meshes into the same struggle. And so I think just talk to people and keep talking to people.
I think that's great. And, you know, emphasizing, you know, growing the movement at the same time, bringing more people in through that process, right? Because those stories do strengthen the story, right? The narrative. I'd just like to point out that in our chat right now, we do have some student parent workers who are saying that they would love to speak to journalists. So this is for the journalists who may be watching this recording later, that what are you fighting for is definitely a very under-asked question during the UC strike, according to an organizer who was there mentioning that in the chat. So that's just to put an exclamation point on everything that Joseph and Lauren just said. So I think that's great. We've talked about how journalists might source for their stories better, for their reporting better. We also talked about the importance of context, knowing sort of the what came before the conflict, what came before the labor dispute. But not everything, not every experience with media coverage is bad, of course, right? And so I'm hoping that with this next topic, we could talk about some of the positive experiences that you've both had with journalists. And let's just go to Lauren here.
Yeah, so this is a great question. And I'll say for my part, I've had a lot of positive experiences with journalists since I've started working at Underpaid. I think particularly because of the strange circumstances we're in a right to work state, Underpaid has learned to love coverage and has learned to sort of mobilize that to get attention for what we want from the university. So I'll say that what I've noticed as a sort of general pattern, and then a good antidote to that, is often, a journalist brings in 1, 2, or many members from the organizing committee in for an interview, asks us, maybe not exactly what are you fighting for, but different questions about our progress, our asks, etc. And then sort of just to fact check and to give context, as I would too, goes to the administration and sort of ask them to speak back to what we've said. And not to sort of paint with too broad a brush here, but many times the university has a kind of canned response, right? Sometimes it addresses what we've said, sometimes it doesn't, but very rarely are we given a chance to speak back to that response, right? So it ends up reading as if sort of the administration has the last word, the budget doesn't have money for it, period, right? Or whatever it is, or, the MIT living wage calculator doesn't work, which is something we've heard. And so we don't get a chance to sort of speak back to that, to clarify, to actually add really crucial dimensions to what the administration has said. But recently, I was talking to a reporter who was really interested in sort of understanding not only the sort of longer histories and bigger context that I was referring to earlier, but also wanted us to address past administration responses as well as sort of more immediate ones, right? And that was really amazing to do because we could, for example, in this particular situation, we could fact check a sort of, how would I call it? A sort of, misinterpretation or a kind of false, the word is not appearing to me right now, but a sort of mischaracterization of what was going on. And then, we could go on record correcting that and giving evidence in support. So that felt like a more sort of comprehensive dialogue between graduate students and the administration.
Great. Yes. Joseph?
Yeah, again, I'll echo everything Lauren said. I think I haven't personally had too much experience interacting with journalists myself, but sort of seeing the coverage we've had, I think sort of the best coverage around us has sort of done that fact checking. Because like Lauren was saying, sort of these university bosses and bosses in general kind of have these cute little quips they like to cite and quote, but they're often kind of laced with lies or fallacies. It's really well-crafted language. And so whether you have a worker do the fact checking and you quote them in that, or you do it yourself and kind of explain, really goes a long way. It kind of removes the idea that it's just two people at a table debating and exposing it for really what it really is. It's a lot of workers who really know what they're fighting for versus a couple of people high at the top. It brings the context into the picture very crystal clear. What we like to do when we were trying to get people out to sign cards, we had these flyers with bingo cards, and I kind of had everything that we were anticipating the university administrators to say. We got a bingo pretty quickly after a couple emails, but they would say the same kind of things in their press releases, or when journalists would talk to them that, oh, this one size fits all union approach is bad. This is going to disrupt the operations that we've had for a while. It'll disrupt the status quo. But then if you would talk to a worker, it's like, oh, well, this status quo is why we have to operate a food pantry. So you have to expand more on that and make sure that the current situation of the workers, what they're fighting for, is very transparent and well known. Yeah, I love the bingo cards.
Yeah, that's really great, Joseph. And it's as simple as when you go and you speak to the workers, right? Those canned responses from administration tend to fall apart pretty quickly. So I want us to be sure we have time for the Q&A. So for this last general topic, what ultimately are the changes you're hoping your organizing efforts will accomplish? Goals and demands. We can start with Joseph this time.
Yeah, I think it's all pretty broad. So personally, I have some big visions about like common good organizing. I like to see whether we're at the University of Texas or Boston University or Harvard, USC, Temple, wherever, we're all fighting the same struggle. And it doesn't matter if we're graduate students or the residence life workers at BU just announced their union, or postdocs, non-tenure track faculty. We're all fighting university administrators who have taken control of our working conditions and are not letting us dictate our working conditions. So I like to see that we're fighting the same struggle. We're in the labor movement together, and I like to think that we can all do that fight together across state boundaries. And I think it also includes the people that are touched by the university. In Boston, there is a particularly terrible housing crisis going on right now. Boston just became the second most expensive city to rent in the country, and it is in large part due to the housing shortage. All the universities in the area have been buying up housing, and they've just grown their enrollment so much that there's this immense shortage of housing. It's kicking out established tenants from the neighborhoods they've been living in, making students compete with those tenants for places to live. And so I really like to think we can get creative with the bargaining and organizing we do to change that landscape. And it will take a long time. It might take decades, but I think it's something worth fighting for, even if I won't be around to see that change while I'm a member of the BU community. So I think there are really big long-term struggles to fight for along those lines. In the more immediate term, like a PhD kind of time scale, I like to think that I want to fight to not just have a union that has an active, maybe 25% of the unit who's actively engaged, but really aiming for a supermajority. I've been going to some trainings by Jane McAlevey, who's on the faculty at UC Berkeley and does a lot of these trainings. She has an organization called Organizing for Power. And she likes to say, you got to aim to get to 90%, at least 90%. And it's hard when you have a massive unit of, often at these really big R1 universities, 3,000 plus graduate workers. But it doesn't mean it's very much easier if you have a unit of 100 people. Getting a lot of people who have very complicated and different lives to be active in something else that's really volunteer is hard. But it's not impossible. And so in the shorter term, I want to aim for a very democratic, active union that's really engaging everyone who's under our contract.
Thanks, Joseph. It's a really great point that you raised about the long term and then the near term, given that as workers in this position, it's a liminal space. It's a liminal time in our lives and careers. Lauren, how about you? What are the goals? What are we hoping to accomplish at UT?
Yeah, so part of what I was going to say really follows up on what Joseph was just saying, which is great. Speaking generally, I want to see a more robust union culture at UT. I want people to know their rights. I want people to know what it means to work in a right to work state. I want people to know that that doesn't mean joining a union is illegal. And I want to see more people being actively involved in our struggle, because that's the only way that we're going to get something to happen, at least on the scale of what we're asking for and what we're dreaming of, right? In the more immediate term, I want UT to show us a plan of what it would look like and the timescale to get every single graduate worker to a living wage here. You know, it may not happen while I'm here. I only have a semester left, right? But I want to see it roll out. I want to see them address our concerns in, you know, an actual material, thoughtful way. And I want to see them fix the problems with our healthcare coverage. It's just untenable as it is. But so I think these two things are connected, right? I think a more robust activist culture among graduate students can help bring this stuff out. And yeah, I really want to see a world where graduate students really see themselves, you know, in common and in, you know, sort of collective recognition together, rather than in their own labs or in their own classrooms, sort of scattered across the university.
Well said. Yeah. So we only have about 15 more minutes. So I think it's a good time to be transitioning into some questions from our audience. So if you have a question, please put it into the chat.
Oh, I have a question while folks are typing their questions. First of all, thank you both and Brad for all of this. I think it's been so useful and insightful. I want to preface this by saying that I was indeed a graduate student in one of the most expensive housing markets in the country, in the Bay Area. And then I worked in precarity for 3 years after that. So as I ask this question, please don't think I have changed my mind about some fundamental principles. But I think one thing that many journalists, especially journalists who are new to covering labor issues, that they sometimes struggle with is that in a lot of journalism instruction and guidance, they're told to look for people who have beat the odds, people who have lifted themselves up by their bootstraps, who have, you know, gotten up at 5 a.m., not stopped working, worked 3 jobs, and then made it, you know, climbed this hierarchy ladder, and that is a good story. That's a good thing. And then we have unions and collective organizing, which don't really abide by that narrative, right? There's not one heroic person to feature. There's not necessarily a narrative of going from rags to riches. I wonder what your thoughts are on that and how journalists could think about what the story is in your efforts.
I think that's a really interesting question. And I think that it sort of puts its finger on actually what is so kind of unique, sometimes challenging, but also I think in the end rewarding about organizing in higher ed, right? Because this sort of competitive, rise above everything, hustle until your fingers fall off is, you know, is so endemic to academia in general, right? And so working to unthink some of that, like, you know, in my own life, in my own sort of like work with other graduate students, and to see the sort of like, you know, promise of collective working is like really crucial to this fight. You know, in terms of practical advice of sort of how to get there, I'm not sure that I can sort of give a really great one-liner, but I think like recognizing that itself is sort of like what you were talking back to, what you're reporting on, that like this culture of sort of rising above and of like individuation, I think as like a harmful thing, is so tied up in academia. And it's part of, you know, I think at the core what a lot of people are fighting for, even if it's implicit.
Joseph, would you like to add?
Yeah, I agree with that. And I'm not a journalist, but in science, we do publish, we write. And so I sympathize with the want to have, you know, a really catchy lead. I'm an astronomer. I want to find, you know, really cool stars and planets and stuff. And so I sympathize with that, but sometimes you just have to be real. I mean, in science, if you publish fake stuff, it's garbage. So maybe you can use this sort of meritocratic falsehood and leverage that as the lead. You know, in reality, it's not this pretty picture for graduate students. They have picked themselves up by their bootstraps, done all this hard work, and it's not rewarding them. They're not seeing the benefits that they deserve. They're still struggling in their workplace. They're not being treated with dignity. They don't have agency over their workplace. And so, yeah, I don't think I know what else really to say to it, other than it is difficult because you live in this sort of paradigm where that's like the almost expectation, the norm. But if you want to have sort of the press that really authentically speaks to the struggles that workers go through, you will have to break from that norm, I think. And that can still be very successful. And I think that will be the coverage that, you know, if you can build allies among workers will read it.
That's great. All right, so we have 2 questions that will kind of similar. From Cassie, do you have any recommendations on terminology journalists should or shouldn't be using in stories related to labor issues?
So I think this is, I think speaks for itself in some ways, but I would definitely just check on terminology, especially, you know, with the workers that you're talking to, because I imagine it really shifts in terms of context. To give one example, you know, I don't know if I can speak for everyone in underpaid when I say this, but I can speak for myself. I try to avoid saying graduate student when I can. I try to say graduate student worker, graduate worker, something like that. The reason for this is that a lot of people actually don't know that graduate students aren't exactly the same as undergrads, right? That we are professionals that work for the university, and that we're not sort of like going to classes on the regular the way that undergrads do. And so sometimes, you know, this word student, even if it's true, and I say it all the time, I call myself a graduate student because that's my title, right? You know, in these contexts, I try to avoid it because I think it can kind of like, you know, endorse some incorrect assumptions about what it means to have the job that I have. And so, you know, if, for example, hypothetically, a journalist was to ask me about that word or like how I think of myself as a worker, I would be ecstatic to be able to clarify that and have that be part of the story.
Thanks so much, Lauren. Yeah, that's great. Joseph, do you want to add on specifically this term or any other terminology that you'd like to comes to mind?
Yeah, that's definitely the biggest in our field. And even, but I think it extends throughout higher ed. You know, faculty are workers. I think, I feel like there are other examples, but I'm struggling to think of them. It might just mean that you have to familiarize yourself with the labor movement a little. I think I've found some pretty good like weekly newsletters. One I really like is called Who Gets the Bird? And so that way you can kind of sort of get familiar with the jargon. But yeah, for this context, definitely lean into worker.
So from Adam, we have, what is the worst experience you had with a journalist covering your activist work? And what did they say or do specifically that was wrong so we as journalists can learn how to better report this issue?
Yeah, and maybe I can just expand Adam's great question just a little bit. This could be a journalist you interacted with directly or journalism that you've seen out in the internet.
I can start. So I had an uncomfortable experience that I actually think arose from mutual misunderstanding, which I think is always something that can happen. I wasn't really clear what the journalist motives were when they were asking me the question that they were asking. And so because of that, I was a bit on the defensive and I wasn't able to sort of like marshal a really good response. And it was this kind of really tense, gross situation that I would like to avoid in the future. The question was something sort of like, it was like the bad version of the good question that Joseph was giving us earlier, right? It was sort of like, why are you doing this and why does it relate? The event in particular was Underpaid was protesting Jay Hartzell's inauguration, which, you know, there are a lot of reasons I could give you for why that is connected to workers' rights, specifically for graduate students. But because I had a sort of antagonistic interaction with this reporter, I didn't get to enumerate any of those. It sort of seemed like they were sort of saying, why are you doing this random thing that I can't understand? And so, you know, I think it hurt both of us in the end, right? I wasn't able to advocate for my cause and they weren't able to sort of understand why we were there or give the story context. So that's one example.
Yeah, Joseph?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned earlier that I haven't had too much interaction myself, being interviewed and working with journalists on our campaign and our union struggle. But I can think of two particular examples of some press we had that I thought was pretty poor. There was some coverage we had in the Boston Globe immediately following our election. We had heard that we would get a full feature in the Globe, but it ultimately amounted to just being like a little one paragraph blurb saying, BU graduate workers won their union election. They had an interview, or they had a single sentence basically from the local's president. So citing only union representatives, not the workers. And then I think there was also a little one-liner from someone representing BU. And then another particularly bad example for a different reason, but reasons we discussed earlier, was Boston University has its own in-house kind of press team thing, outlet, I guess, called BU Today. And so every day of the week, they have a new BU Today thing. And there was an article in there about our unionization. And if I recall correctly, they were saying something like, there have been efforts among the graduate workers to unionize before. Now they're fighting for a $47,000 minimum stipend in line with the living wage from MIT, which will be an increase. I think the actual quote was almost, which will be an increase from what it's currently at. And so I think that's an example of like sorely lacking that context. It's not the biggest increase for some people, depending on their department or program, but for some people, that's almost 100%, if not greater than 100%. And it's also not expanding into what a living wage means. So kind of just getting at just sort of the ideas we were talking about earlier, context, who's included in the press, whether it be in a full-length feature or a single little blurb.
So we're going to sneak in one more question here at the end from Alexandra, which is to shorten it, how can journalists learn what labor unions are actually for and how they differ from nonprofits or NGOs, these kind of more corporate structures that maybe they're increasingly modeled after? And this is something maybe sharing resources that our audience can check out later would be an option for as well.
I think one thing that comes to mind for me, sort of like more specific than just research the history and strategies of labor unions, right, is like more specifically research what is happening right now for some labor organizers to try and fix or radicalize or reinvigorate their own unions, right? Groups like Troublemakers, for example, who are working to sort of like figure out how to sort of decalcify, for example, some of the practices of their unions might give you a good idea of sort of like, not only like how these, groups are different from like NGOs or whatever, but also like what else is possible and what else certain, union members are looking for and advocating for that may not be covered by the sort of status quo of a union, whatever that might be.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, everyone, we are regrettably at time for our panel this evening. Please join me in thanking both of our panelists for sharing their time and so many of their experiences with us. With labor organizing on the rise, it's essential for journalists to report on labor issues in a way that ensures the dignity of workers within the stories they're writing about. And I feel our panel has really addressed that issue from many different angles. Thanks, Lauren. Thanks, Joseph. There's a link to mediaengagement.org/solidary-journalism in the chat. And yeah, our emails are also in the chat, and you are welcome to get in touch with us if you'd like to keep the conversation going or are more interested in the work that we do at the Solidary Journalism Initiative. So thank you, everybody, and take care.